to the inaugural first week-long session of the Urban Education Brown Bag series. This series is sponsored by the Department of Urban Education and also the Cornwall Center. Before we start, I also want to give a special thank you to Dr. Michael Simmons, who's been pivotal in helping me get this organized and together. So I truly thank him for his time and for his efforts. But today, to kick off our series, we have Dr. Laura Porterfield. She's coming to us from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and she is an associate professor of educational foundations. Dr. Porterfield is an urban educator, Black feminist, visualist, and youth culture scholar. She is a fierce youth advocate who believes in her life's work to prepare inspiring and quality future educators and to demand equitable educational opportunity for all. Her work draws primarily from education, sociology, anthropology, gender studies, and geography. So what we're going to do today is we're going to pass it over to Dr. Porterfield, who will be doing her presentation. As you have questions, please put them in the chat. And we will attend to everyone's questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, I pass it over to you, Dr. Porterfield.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I'd like to again extend my thanks to Dr. Lynette Mulwiney, the chair of the Department of Urban Ed, and also the Cornwall Center for inviting me to come and share some of my thoughts on the very timely issue of safety in urban schools for Black and other youth of color. I speak to these issues, as Dr. Mulwiney just alluded to, primarily as a visual sociologist and urban teacher educator. I'm not a safety scholar, but I've been thinking about these issues for many years, and I'm really happy to have the space to talk with you about them. I'd like to start by taking a moment to sort of recognize and honor the resilience and pain and exhaustion and fight and anger, all of these things that we're feeling in this moment, particularly in the months following a year of so much instability, of tremendous loss, of hope, and also of uncertainty. Over the last several years, months and years, I'm thinking particularly in response to the devastating murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, we've been more attentive to and thinking about and aware of the way visual texts in particular have literally allowed us to see and re-see violence against people of color, but especially against Black boys, men, girls, and women, both in mainstream and in social media. Citations of these visual incidents they're sort of increasingly used in research literature and legal proceedings, sort of as these texts become more available for public consumption. Some, sort of thick description of these incidents of Officer Ben Fields assaulting a young Black woman at Spring Valley High School in South Carolina, 5-year-old Jaisha Scott being handcuffed for having a temper tantrum, of young Tacovia Allen's punishment for kicking a teacher aide. They're all used to sort of frame our understanding of the problem of violence or safety or lack thereof against the Black body in the school, in the nation, and sort of beyond. Narratives surrounding these acts of violence and punishment point to the ongoing and long-standing antagonisms between the police state and Black communities. And they, I think, really articulate the need for responsive social movements such as Black Girls Matter and Say Her Name, and sort of represent incisive critiques of the school to prison pipeline and the carceral prison industrial complex. But despite the growing availability and usage of still and video footage of violence against Black youth in our public conversations on safety, and also despite some renewed calls to understand and respond to the problem of safety for Black and other youth of color in schools and beyond, a sort of empirical understanding of safety, especially at urban schools, remains almost rigidly, narrowly focused through eliminating physical violence alone, right? Because especially when it comes to seeing acts of violence, the visual does something to us, right? What does seeing and re-seeing and re-seeing and re-seeing acts of violence against people of color due to our sense of feeling safe. Taken one way, seeing and re-seeing acts of violence orients us, to borrow from Sarah Ahmed, to a sort of long-standing yet novel reality, one in which violence against people of color is routine, and evidence from those acts can be played and replayed with the click of a button or a series of swipes. Taken another way, what seeing and re-seeing these acts of violence does to us is it orients us to the spectacle of what Jared Sexton calls the popular theater of cruelty, right? Within this popular theater of cruelty, as Connie Moon puts it, punishment is primary and foundational to anti-Black racism. The impacts of these orientations, the production of these spectacles impact our collective consciousness in so many unanswered ways. Namely, it makes the threat of violence against the Black body constant and wide-reaching, such that we as a collective national body and global public often feel less safe. But what exists beyond the absence of violence, discipline, and punishment that lends to an increased feeling of safety? How does engagement with the visual in schools, especially for young Black women, how could it help us better understand safety and what it more fully means to feel safe? Visual examples are used anecdotally to support arguments, make claims about the breadth and power of acts of institutional and/or personal violence on young people. But for the most part, our empirical analysis hasn't really taken up how these visual texts actually inform and fundamentally reshape the cultural landscape of safety in schools. In and outside of the school context, Black youth are routinely subject to punishment, to criminalization, and to assault. A growing cadre of urban educators, critical race theorists, legal scholars have really documented the relative dearth of research exploring the linkages between punitive school disciplinary policies and quote unquote safety measures for Black girls in particular, right? And addressing this gap is vital. And here's why. Black girls are the fastest growing population in the criminal justice system. They're suspended 6 times more often than their white counterparts, and they face statistically greater chance of suspension and expulsion compared to other female identified students. In their work with the African American Policy Forum, Kimberly Crenshaw, Priscilla Ocean, and Jyoti Nanda found that schools myopically focused on discipline often created a school environment where many girls became disengaged from the learning process, particularly those schools with increased levels of law enforcement and the very visual spectacle of security rituals, such as passing through metal detectors. Now, as a result of their work with the African American Policy Forums, the authors really call us, they beg us to do more research looking at the push and pull factors that shape girls' attachment to and feelings of safety inside of school. So this is really where I want to pick up the conversation on urban school safety. How has urban school safety traditionally been conceived? Well, by and large, our understanding of safety in and around the urban school is shaped primarily by our understanding of it as a problem, right? So framed within a discourse of zero tolerance on the one hand and anti-police involvement in racial inequality on the other, the public has really come to associate school safety with school violence, right? So in this way, safety is an outcome by which violence is sort of remediated or prevented. Over the past 3 decades, school safety research has been focused on various types of behaviors related to safety and discipline, including aggression, like verbal assaults, bullying, social exclusion and hate crimes, and violence, and sexual assault, gang violence. Dakota Irby in particular called attention to the shift in our understanding of school safety, noting that the introduction of the Gun-Free Schools Act in 1994 played a major role in really altering our understanding of safety in school from sort of, benign terms like cleanliness and reduction of risks and hazards and building conditions to more punitive disciplinary codes and also school security. To be sure, he argues, and I'm of the same mind, that we need to reduce and alleviate student victimization and create a sense of safety in schools. It's absolutely of utmost importance. But I question, and Irby sort of does the same in his work, in particular, the law enforcement model that was created in response to these larger public anxieties around school safety issues, most notably school shootings, because they exacerbate disciplinary infractions and actually do little to ensure school safety. Instead, the law enforcement model creates what Dakota Irby calls net widening, or the increased scope of infractions that lead to disciplinary action, and also net deepening, right? Increased severity of punishment effects, where more students are likely to get into more trouble more often and be punished more severely. So these deep and wide nets disproportionately penalize poor youth and youth of color in urban areas especially. And while controversial, zero tolerance policy has gained considerable ground among policymakers, school safety advocates, parents, since its introduction over 20 years ago. But research has really done little to substantiate the law enforcement model under zero tolerance as an effective method for achieving safety, particularly for students of color in urban schools. In their seminal work, Skiba and Peterson sort of theorized that schools with no reported crime, what they found was that schools with no reported crime were in fact less likely to have used a zero tolerance policy, even after several years of implementation. They found that some data suggests that certain strategies, such as strip searches or undercover agents in school, may in fact create emotional harm or encourage students to drop out. Given this finding, our analysis really needs to continue to grow in scope to account for a fuller understanding of school safety that takes both affect and belonging into account. So in layman's terms, safety is the state of being safe, or as freedom from risk of injury, danger, or loss. Now we can intuit that this implies a freedom that goes beyond just physical risks of injury, danger, or loss. Empirically, though, we often conflate safety as a lack of physical violence. At times, the rhetorical safety violence binary is articulated as safety or security, but safety, more broadly conceptualized, is felt, right? Because feelings have everything to do with our relationships with particular spaces. We learn to enjoy particular spaces depending on our emotional attachments to them. Our emotional attachments, they're inextricably linked to how we navigate our world. So in this way, both our emotions, our affective responses, and visuality sort of become central to our understanding of safety. Now, affect, or something first experienced in the body and then named and re-experienced through social relations and culture, is akin to emotion and really central to our reconceptualization of safety. And while safety is physically felt in the body, as sort of routinely articulated, safety also stems from visual, affective, and sort of discursive responses to environmental stimuli that really change depending on a particular space or place. A close analysis of select videos taken by youth and community members uploaded to YouTube or reported on the news of altercations with school resource officers and police officers really provides us with examples of affective responses to the events that were recorded, right? Shouts from onlookers, you can hear, if you play these videos, groans of pain or protests from the young Black women being slammed to the ground or dragged, calls to action from SROs or police officers. They're all responses to collective experiences that are first felt in the body, right? Shouts, groans, calls, and then renamed and re-experienced through a wider social media audience or mainstream media audience. And technology, it plays a key role here too, and not technology in the sort of way we commonly refer to it. Technology refers to a sort of collection or assemblage of knowledge, of practices, techniques, and discourses used by human beings on others or on themselves to achieve particular ends. So, to achieve compliance, SROs and police officers often deploy bodily practices, right? assembled knowledge disseminated through their professional training, such as subduing and or physical manipulation. The technology of body slamming or flipping, then, is used to achieve the purported end of safety and order. But in the work I'll share with you today, I want to demonstrate how visual school culture is a technology of affect, which can best be understood as an assemblage of material culture and the built environment. Through the use of the built environment and of material culture, school communities construct a visual school culture that present or represent a technological deployment, carefully selected material artifacts, signs, symbols, constructed interior and exterior spaces that all house a school community. Again, this technological deployment is an assemblage or collection of all the knowledges, practices, techniques, and discourses that are used to achieve particular affective ends. Traditional deployments of visual school culture technology in urban schools reproduce prison technology and form, in addition to factory design, right? Structural elements and routinized practices such as metal detectors and entry screenings, barred windows, protected administrative offices that allow leadership to see but not be seen, the use of bells to signal changes in shifts or periods, single file line movements from one place to the next, and so on. Now, the ubiquity of these type of learning environments, taken together with the demographics of urban schools across the nation, render visible or invisible the sort of foundational racist construction of urban schools. In this case, we should think of safety, or the lack thereof, in the urban school context as an affective outcome of the use of very racialized visual school culture technology. Race and racism here operate as technologies of affect as well, because for youth of color, and particularly for young Black women, affective experiences are always shaped by the technologies of gender, race, and racism. Viewing race and racism as technologies of affect captures the ways in which flows of affect sort of coalesce to form a social phenomenon that is behind the individual's subjective responses, feelings, and sensibilities. Notwithstanding personal agency, flows of affect or feelings often come together on the Black female body in such a way that she is often seen as a problem. As cultural scholar Nicole Fleetwood puts it, she is, quote, always already troubling, close quote. Today, I want us to sort of turn the lens and trouble our traditional understanding of safety in the urban school context. I present the expertise, images, and voices of 5 brilliant young working class Black sophomores and juniors from a small science and tech magnet school in Philly, Azalea, Raven, Marisha, Daria, and Shamima, who were asked to capture spaces both in and outside of schools where they felt safe, right? I connected with Azalea, Raven, Marisha, Daria, and Shamima while doing a larger visual ethnographic project at Einstein High School, which is a small project in inquiry-based science and tech school with a racially, economically, and geographically mixed student body. Using sort of discourse analysis, ethnographic methods to analyze their images and narratives, the girls' photos really surface the sort of affective power of place. And that's what I want to spend some time kind of talking about together. The girls created and collected these images in response to prompts that I emailed them in a photo elicitation focus group, connected with some guiding questions like, where do you feel safe? Do you feel safe at Einstein? My overall question really sought to parse out the relationship between young Black women, visual school culture, and their perception of safety. During our focus groups, they sort of took turns reporting on their photos, marking on the interesting things that they found. And all of these methods allowed us together to sort of respond to this guiding question and unearth the school's approach to constructing and maintaining its own visual culture. So one of the photography prompts that I asked the girls to capture was, where do you feel safe? And interestingly, not, they all decided to submit these images separately and independently, but the home became a sort of salient pattern, and it was an iconic visual symbol that represented safety to almost all of them. Raven, Marisha, Daria, Shamima, they all related feeling safe to feeling at home, right? Common threads that ran throughout the girls' narratives are about how safety meant freedom, right? Comfort, feeling a sense of ownership over their spaces. Raven connected feeling safe to feeling comfortable and happy. For Marisha, safety was tied into privacy and being able to like use her bed leisurely. Interestingly, both Daria and Shamima noted that they felt safe in their rooms and on their beds because they got to escape from their family, teenager stuff. But overall, their definitions of safety are really linked to places of privacy and intimacy. That they said and chose to visually represent safety primarily through images of the home, I think indicates just how important places of safety were in their everyday lives, right? Safe places were places of being, right? Oneself, comfortable, happy, of doing, reading or TV watching, and of respite from family life and from the world, right? And in this way, visualization of safety for the girls were linked to some affective productions. Another question I asked was, do you feel safe at Einstein? A salient pattern in the girls' commentary revealed that being at Einstein often stirred up emotions that made it feel more like home than school. And these feelings about safety at Einstein were correlated, at least in some way, to the fact that they didn't look or feel anything like their old learning environments, their comprehensive public schools or their charter schools or religious institutions. But moving from their previous school environments to Einstein sort of brought into sharp focus was the contrast in visual school culture and climate. Right, for all of the young women, again, who went to different types of schools, their former schools approached school design, visual school culture, and discipline more traditionally. Both Raven, a 15-year-old sophomore from West Philly, and Shamima, who was also a 15-year-old sophomore from North Philly, they transitioned from very strict public and charter schools to Einstein. Prior to enrolling, Shamima, for example, had attended 7 neighborhood private and charter schools. She recalled constant visits to the nurse's office with a headache at one of her former primary schools. Her middle school, Students First Academy, was almost entirely Black, 96%. The school practiced strict discipline, complete with a tightly enforced dress code and an escort policy that required students to be accompanied by a school adult, single file, from one class to another. Both Marisha and Daria moved from private religious institutions to Einstein. Marisha, a 15-year-old sophomore from Southwest Philly, transferred to Einstein mid-year from North Philly Christian Academy, which is a religious high school in the lower North Central area of the city. And in addition to being a Christian institution, NPCA is predominantly Black as well. So moving from a relatively homogenous conservative school like NPCA to Einstein, Marisha really believed that it helped her appreciate difference in a new way, while she also found a community in this new school. Daria left a prestigious all-girls, mostly white Lady of Our Lord Catholic school in the Philly suburbs, transitioning from this massive Victorian building that was once an orphanage. Daria really told me that the fact that Einstein was so small was one of the first things that she noticed. She was really struck by how small, both physically and symbolically, it was after having attended Catholic schools for most of her life. Lastly, a 16-year-old junior, Azalea, who's originally from the Caribbean, she transferred from a large, predominantly Asian at around 49%, Black at around 30%, and Latinx at around 11% neighborhood public school during her second year in the States. Her South Philly school had previously received local press about the poor condition of the building and was later slated for closure. Azalea, who previously attended arguably the most traditional urban public school, she articulated the following response in to the question of, do you feel safe at Einstein? She said, yes, at Einstein, you don't see nobody bullying the other person. I don't see it. Since I've been here, I haven't seen nobody getting bullied or nothing where it threatens another student's life. I haven't seen that. So I feel safer than at Gopher. You know, maybe they think the metal detector at Gopher makes them feel safer, but now there's no metal detector, and I feel safer than I was at Gopher where the metal detectors were. So the fact that I'm not seeing the violence being played out in the hall at lunchtime, I feel safe that I know this is a place where there's no more violence and stuff. So I feel better than I was at Gopher. So although her conceptualization of safety here is in fact linked to physical violence, she kind of alludes to the idea that there is something beyond the absence of physical violence that contributes to her sense of safety. She feels safer at Einstein because it's a place with no more violence, right? As a sort of baseline. It exists in her mind's eye as a place free from immediate, visually available displays of victimization. Right? At Einstein, you don't see nobody bullying the other person. She says, I'm not seeing the violence being played out. This visible absence of violence is also felt. She says, so the fact that I'm not seeing the violence being played out, I feel safe. Right? But in her questioning is a disruption to the violence safety binary. She says, maybe they think the metal detector at Gopher makes them feel safer, but now there's no metal detector and I feel safer. Earlier in the interview, Azalea mentioned that she immediately liked Einstein because there wasn't a metal detector sort of experience. No body scans, no metal bars, no prison design. Having recently moved from Jamaica, where metal detector use was highly uncommon in schools, she sort of associated the use of them to airport security and prison entries or government buildings. I mean, she understood the logic that metal detectors were supposed to keep people from being able to carry weapons or other materials that could harm someone else. But she questioned the use of the mechanism as a way of making her feel safe. She went on to say, at Einstein, you have the freedom to do what you want. You know, you can sign in and leave and come back. There's a trust here. Adults trust the students. That go for that same level of trust isn't present. At Einstein, they trust their students. And people know their boundaries here, more or less. I mean, sometimes you have people who test the boundaries, though, but when you know your boundaries, you're freer. Freedoms change expectations. At Gopher, Azalea told me that once you were inside in the metal detectors, you couldn't leave. You were either confined to waiting outside until 7:30 or came in and stayed in the cafeteria, which was the only space students were allowed outside of classrooms. At Einstein, as she notes above, students could sign in, they would go across the street to the deli, then come back. Evident to her through this practice was there was a different option, right? One based on a greater level of both freedom and trust. The metal detectors at Gopher didn't produce in her the same feelings of safety, nor did they engender the sort of self-monitoring behaviors she referenced were implicit in being trusted. Rather than approaching safety in the more traditional way, right, using metal detectors or instituting net widening and net deepening disciplinary policies, Principal Nate Roth of Einstein approached safety with more regard for affect. His idea of safety was that students could come to Einstein and feel free to roam, act like kids, and learn. He said, that's my understanding of safety, right? You can come in and you can learn. Unlike some other people who think that to keep these kids safe, you need to have them go through metal detectors. I don't think that makes kids safe. I don't know what kid wants to learn after having gone through a metal detector. He went on to say, you know, it really says a lot about a school, about the approach, especially when a majority of your kids are minority kids. There's this idea that we need to put in metal detectors. It's a very particular approach that we didn't take for that reason. It was a design decision. Now, I'm sure that Principal Roth's decision to exclude metal detectors from the redesign of what was once an old HR building was also based on his desire to create a safe school for all of his students. But the decision was especially vital to him, knowing that the majority of his students were students of color. And in his comments, he refers, as Azalea does, to an outside other who chooses differently. Right? In a school district wherein most of the student body is comprised of students of color, right, who represent approximately 80% of the district's student body, instituting the highly visual technology of metal detectors functions symbolically and semiotically to communicate a general lack of trust, right? The official rhetoric and logic still stands that they're used to deter violence, but in an urban school context, they operate in a field of vision that associates violence, trouble, and criminality with poverty and Blackness. Even in a school environment where metal detectors were not used, like in Shamima's Young Scholars Academy, the zero tolerance-esque disciplinary policies imposed on students visually communicated some of the same things. As previously mentioned, Shamima and her classmates were really taught the hidden curriculum of disciplinary norms and behavior within a very punitive framework. They're to be moved single file in a line from one class to another, accompanied by an adult at all times while out of class. They operated on a demerit system. So accordingly, the practices through which school adults at Young Scholars achieved sort of disciplinary adherence was from a place of control. School officials asserted that the students, who were again predominantly Black, needed to be managed, disciplined, and controlled. So following this logic, safety was achieved through discipline, and discipline was achieved through control. But neither the safety practices at Young Scholars or at Gopher made Shamima or Azalea feel safe. What both of their narratives highlight, I think, is that safety is felt in tandem with feeling free and trusted. The contrastive shift in visual culture that contributed to the young Black women's senses of safety can be found right at the entry of the school. As these sort of figures illustrate, there's no pseudo prison infrastructure. These are images of the front of Einstein, the front doors. There's no prison infrastructure greeting students at the entry. This absence is productive in so much that it engenders feelings of welcome and invitation. As Shamima notes, I think because it don't look like a school building, it actually makes me want to be here for more. Like it actually makes me want to be here in school. If I was going to a normal school where there was like wood floors and big windows with bars on them, I'd be depressed as crap. Like, who wants to sit in that one room all day like you're in jail? At this school, it don't look like you're in jail. So it just makes you feel like you want to actually be here for the time you have to be here. Shamima's response is really telling. Her spatial reference to what a school looks like is a jail. And although this reference isn't uncommon or new in any way, in fact, it's very similar to Azalea's, it's significant because it reveals how seemingly normal and expected prison design is in the discourse around urban public schools. Shamima's comments also speak to the emotional effect of this type of approach to design. Depression. In a different space, i.e. at Einstein, the absence produces different types of feelings like desire and a sense of welcome. She says it just makes you feel like you want to be here. So it's kind of inviting. This sense of welcome and invitation continues as you move through the space. Like their attachments to home and the privacy and intimacy that it afforded, the nooks and crannies and backspaces were favorites amongst almost all the girls because they provided spaces where they could be and just think. Daria's favorite spaces in the school were the balconies. She liked them because she could sit outside and chill, taking the breeze, listen to the cars. I asked her what she and her friends did in those spaces, and she said that they just mostly did a lot of people watching. She was also attracted to the back hallways, like the one pictured here, because she could just catch up on things going on in the school by talking with other people. Shamima's favorite spaces were also places where she could just chill or do work. She frequented what Einstein folks call the rear hall because it gave her room to catch up on her project or read. Her attachments to the real hall are premised on her perception that it's a space where she can just be, right? And not just because school adults won't kick her out of the space, but because she's actually invited to be there in the first place. She stated that the ways people interact with the space at Einstein was really different. People sat on the window ledges, on the floors in the hallways, in front of the lockers. At our old schools, no one sat anywhere outside of the cafeteria. And if they did sit, they sat on top of the radiators, but mostly they didn't sit. At Einstein, she added, there were some places for her to congregate, to do work. not very outgoing or social people, both Azalea and Mauricia were attracted to sort of informal spaces that were isolated and quiet. Azalea's favorite space in the school was, again, what Einstein folks refer to as the second floor ballroom, which sits in the transitional space between the school library and classrooms on the second main thoroughfare. Now, like the rear hall that we just saw, there's no formal use for this space. Azalea liked to perch up on a chair early in the morning. She took this when she was sitting on the floor. During our first focus group, she explained why she liked sitting on the floor here in the second floor ballroom so much. She said, I took a picture right outside this hallway. I was just sitting there and I was like, you see so much stuff. I think you learn from the charts and just by sitting there watching the students. This particular ballroom is an excellent place in the school both to see and be seen. But this space took on a different use for Azalea. And also Shamima, who in the same focus group said it was a useful place to get help or ask questions when necessary. Mauricia's photo of the third floor table and chairs is also a place that affords privacy, right? This sort of recurring theme of privacy and intimacy is important to note here. Mauricia said this particular space had a touch of cozy and it sat near the corner of the hallway. The multiple use of both the table and chairs and the second floor ballroom and the rear hallway, they just made them ideal third spaces, right? They can open up depending on what the user needed. And for all of the girls, as a sort of summary, all of these spaces stood out as ones that were just there for the using, free and open for just that, right? So here we return to sort of the larger question at play. How does the engagement with visual in schools, especially for young Black women, help us better understand safety and what it means to feel safe? The girls' feelings in and about Einstein specifically were productive, right? They were initially productive because they stood in sharp contrast to their feelings about and their emotional distractions in their old learning environments. They engendered a sense of safety. They engendered related feelings of being trusted, not controlled. They engendered expectations and shifts in behavior accordingly. Their feelings about Einstein engendered a larger sense of place because, like home, the space afforded privacy and intimacy. And as the images here taken by the girls of flyers posted around the schools really illustrate, there were visual signals attuned to the emotional and affective needs of the community. Their emotive responses engendered a sense of place because they signaled that there were spaces at Einstein specifically for them. But perhaps most significantly, their emotional attachments engendered a desire to be there, a desire to have the space to learn, right? So no longer sort of immersed in emotional environments that in more ways than not were distracting. The girls became involved in a relationship with Einstein spaces and places in more ways than not that engaged them. Consequently, when the girls were no longer emotionally distracted, they instead became emotionally ready. In Monique Morris's groundbreaking work, Push Out, she poignantly describes the impact that school spaces have on Black girls' learning and the desire, or read, affective consequences to be in school. She says girls draw important connections between their desire to learn and their inability to do so in chaotic learning environments. Across the country, Black girls have repeatedly described rowdy classrooms that prevent them from being able to focus on learning, and in some cases led to their avoidance of school or to reduced engagement in school. Through a distinctive approach to design, material culture that invited looking and laughing, classroom arrangements that were suited to pedagogical needs that also promoted comfort, plenty of informal spaces that allowed students to just do and to be. An increased sense of engagement sort of flourished for the girls. And this increased sense of engagement lent itself to a kind of emotional readiness for the larger task at hand in schools, which is learning, right? In this case, emotional readiness is an affective achievement of safety. And safety in this context is the affective achievement of an engaging visual school culture. Tied into all of these ideas and notions and conceptualizations of safety are ideas of being and affect, being by oneself, comfortable, happy, being oneself, free. All of those things affect feeling trusted, safe, welcome, invited. These conceptualizations about safety were made possible as a result of a purposeful shift in perspective about safety, right? As we rethink safety, the concept of emotional readiness beckons us to also reframe our conversation around what it means to feel safe from one connected only to violence to one also more fully connected to place and belonging. What would it mean for urban schools more generally to adopt a stance that approach safety in this way? As many school districts wrestle with the presence of the police and the police state in their schools, how would a system-wide change in, say, the entrance experience shift students' relationship with schooling, where instead of being greeted by body scans and police presence, students are greeted by other things like signage that communicates community and belonging. Schools can do this, I believe, by changing their approach to environment. For many of the girls, again, the absence of the metal detector actually contributed to a greater sense of safety, which begs the question that many large comprehensive school districts in the country are grappling with. What do metal detectors actually do in the way of making schools more safe? Even more importantly, I think, though, we should be asking, what do they symbolically communicate? How do they reduce or intensify conflict? The simultaneous absence of metal detectors and increased levels of safety felt by the girls at Einstein call us to rethink safety as achieved through this prison technology. In their stead, could we arm schools with other visual technologies, like positively socializing material culture, built environments with nooks and crannies really carved out for student use, amenable classroom layouts that call for student and teacher involvement, and taken further, what could this rearmament do not just for school safety, but also perhaps engagement and belonging? What I want to suggest is that paying a special attention to the environments in which we expect students to learn day in and day out is really paramount to their feelings toward education more generally. As we know, the racial, socioeconomic, cultural, geographic tensions at work across the larger urban landscapes often bleed over into school buildings. In so much that urban educational spaces and places can serve as buffers for conflicts at work elsewhere, schools can better engage youth who, quite frankly, are exhausted by the other battles they have to fight in their daily lives. With cadres of students emotionally ready and safe rather than emotionally distracted, we might be better equipped to deal with other educational and social problems that face urban school communities today. Thank you so very much for listening. I look forward to having some rich conversation with folks around this.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Porterfield. This is wonderful. And we hope to use the time to get some more dialogue going around this topic. We do in the chat have a few questions and some comments. And as other people have them, please go ahead and post. The first question is from Melissa. She's asking, what age group do young Black girls become aware of how the world visualizes them?
Oh, that's a really good question. I do think that girls of color, and particularly Black girls, that's the population I study the most, become socialized and conditioned by society's views and expectations of them at a very early age. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the doll tests, right? These tests performed by psychologists and redone recently, like in the last decade or so, putting up different color dolls and asking a variety, different demographics of girls and boys, and I don't think the study included gender nonconforming young people, but which dolls are the prettiest dolls, which dolls are the smartest dolls, the best dolls, and routinely they select lighter skin, white dolls, even Black girls. So like, where are they getting those attachments from? Like, those are all value judgments, right? This person is better. This doll is smarter. This doll is prettier. That is a result of their conditioning, again, in a society where they're being taught sometimes like blatantly, but sometimes more opaquely or subconsciously and perniciously that they're not the model, right? So unfortunately, I think this happens at a very young age, which I think is why something like a space where we're really, really paying close attention to the visual seems so radical, even though it's simple, right? But I think it is in a larger sort of context, a national, even international, global context where these images are teaching them and they're learning.
Thank you for that. The next question is from Peter. He asked, do rates of disciplining Black girls vary at all with faculty diversity?
That's a good question. Most of the research, I'm thinking a lot about the research done by the African American Policy Forum, the study for the Center for the Study of Intersectionality at UCLA, and most of the research done across the nation are in various large comprehensive urban public schools with a variety of demographic representation of the teacher and student body. So what I think we can extrapolate from that is even in large urban public school districts, say for example, like New York Public Schools, Philly School District, Newark Public Schools, Chicago Public Schools, that have a predominantly white or mixed teaching force, disciplinary infractions do shift, but not enough, right? A lot of the ways we train teachers in teacher preparation programs, and also a lot of the ways security personnel are trained are done so from a place of submission, control, order, discipline. And so the disciplinary infractions, interestingly enough, many of the disciplinary infractions, the codes that come up for Black girls in particular, have to do with bodily comportment, from having a quote unquote attitude, from being disrespectful. All of those are super subjective judgments that lead to Black girls getting in constant trouble and suspension and expulsion, as I mentioned. So though they do vary, I think if they're in a district with more queer BIPOC teachers, they don't eliminate the problems altogether. And in fact, we're seeing those problems sort of system wide, unfortunately.
Thank you. We have a comment here from Preetha. She says it shows how important it is to get students' input into school design. Maybe public schools in urban areas were designed decades ago and reflect the power relations of that time.
Yes, centuries ago, many of them. And even in the 50s and 60s, when a lot of our public school buildings were created, they're created in response to fear of Soviet attack. So they're windowless. They use a particular design approach, a brutalist design approach. I won't get all like super architecturally nerdy on y'all, but and those do reflect particular priorities, visions, and expectations of the people who would be in those buildings, right? And so, but even though that's the case, many public schools now, like this year, are putting up for referendums, like New York Public Schools, Philly Public Schools. I showed a picture of students protesting a 805 policy in Philly of system district-wide metal detectors and police scans, right? So these schools, the buildings themselves were created so long ago, we have the opportunity to adapt those buildings. Einstein readapted an old building, it's not a new one. But we're adapting them in highly problematic ways that really just think about safety for their students in a very particular way. So
it also makes me think of like the concept of homeostasis is comfortable, right? And so it's done like this for centuries, so we just continue it without, being willing to challenge it for the design. Marquise has a question that says, what are your suggestions for building safety and emotional readiness as an external after-school partner in a school that has a culture, of distrust and control of students?
Yeah, that's such an excellent question. And thank you so much for the work that you do and for asking that question. I always say this, and it seems, so simple. Talk to students. I think that we undervalue how important and meaningful receiving an invitation for input is for students who often are on the receiving end of so many initiatives, but never invited to the table when those initiatives are happening. They're only happening to them, not with them. They're often because of them, even if they didn't do anything. And so having conversations, I think one of the cool things about the study I did with these young women and the conversations I had with other young women in the school, these were just my primary participants. They just were like, nobody ever asked us our opinion. Like, could we have more conversations like this? I think as someone who I consider myself an informal educator, I worked in after school spaces, worked in freedom schools, and ran after school programs and summer programs for the better part of a decade. These are like such critical, crucial spaces where you have the opportunity to get close and to have intimate, rich conversations with young people about their everyday emotional distractions, both in school and out of school. And in so much that there are spaces, advocacy groups, oversight committees and boards, and other, new sort of opportunities to advocate and to live out activism around this, starting with the conversations with young people and empowering young people to speak on their own. I think you're in an excellent position to do that.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was at a conference and there was a school in Germany that literally asked the students to design the school. They took the adults out of it and they designed it. And it's something like I've never seen before, what they came up with. So.
Right. Like our imaginations go so far, but they're living in the school, in school now in this contemporary, oh my gosh, like there's stuff we wouldn't even be able to conceptualize. And I think there's as like a youth scholar too, there's something interesting about the way we put so much on young people, particularly teenagers, right? And they're in this really transitional place between childhood and adulthood. And they're often, a mess, right? Because of all the things that are happening with them sort of developmentally. But they have so much to offer us. And I just think that there's opportunity. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I do think there's a lot of opportunity to shift some of our fundamental understanding if we more systematically engage them in decision making and in envisioning and dreaming and hacking, remixing, all those things.
So we have a lot of great questions that are coming in. We might not get to everyone's questions, so you do see Dr. Porterfield's information there if you want to follow up. But our next question is from Cedra. The question is, what are your thoughts on the adoption of surveillance technologies that move beyond physical space and routinely survey students' online behavior to algorithmically deploy punishment for using certain language or posting certain images?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a hard question. first of all, I would say generally those practices and policies, those structural policies, are reactive, right? Reactive to parent complaints about cyberbullying, which is a real concern, which is a valid concern, about hate crimes, valid concern, real concern. But the reactionary nature of the policies, again, they don't get at obviously what it means to create a safe, inclusive school environment, student body. Instead, what we're doing is just approaching remediating the larger issue, the root cause issue, through punitive frameworks, from a punitive place. And that's because we live in an carceral state. Like, our knee-jerk reaction is almost always, when there are problems, infractions, is to deploy some sort of punitive mechanism. Now, I don't want to shortchange the very real, valid concern of hate crimes and cyberbullying. I think that we need, I think we need more nimble and flexible and adaptable responses to those issues that are not reliant solely on punitive surveillance technologies and frameworks. I understand that policymakers in particular are beholden to constituents and funders, and particularly if you're, a lot of those districts that are, or schools that are doing that might be charter schools, independent schools, where they're getting pushback from, school boards, even private schools that are doing that. They're trying to be responsive, but again, this is akin to the zero tolerance policies we instituted 20 years ago after Columbine, and it has brought us back to the same place where we're not addressing the root cause issue. So I think similarly, listen, I don't have like, oh, this is the answer and this is what should be done. But I think by and large, it doesn't get at the root issue, the root cause issue. And it's really steeped in this sort of punitive framework. And we've got to get away from that. We have to push back against that.
And last question that we have time for is from Carolyn. She asks, are you aware of research about urban schools that have reversed the prison visuals in their school design?
Yes. So actually a lot of charter schools, so the 805 referendum that I was just mentioning in Philly was put in place. So they instituted a district-wide policy to use metal detectors and system-wide entry scans, bodily scans. But actually the charter and magnet schools are not beholden to that policy and are pushing back. Einstein is one of them. Years ago was one of the few that didn't have any metal detectors, but more and more have followed suit. And I know of other school districts, say for example, in LA, LA Unified, in Chicago, and here in Milwaukee, where I am, that are rethinking. A lot of schools are rethinking the use of prison technology and prison form in schools as a result of these like large scale calls for using them. So yeah, many of them are pushing back against it in small ways. But again, they're beholden to larger districts that are trying to institute them more district-wide. Again, as a result of school shooting and violence issues. So some of them are, and I think the ones that the charter schools and magnet schools in particular that are bucking that tradition are doing so using the approach of redesign, right? So many charter schools get small grants when they start up. They're using those small grants to reimagine what the school looks like, including what the school looks like at the entry, including what classroom spaces look like, or if there are rooms, sort of as traditionally thought. They're really remixing and rethinking fundamentally how schools should look. and being flexible and adaptable, which is a theme I sort of mentioned. Einstein really hacked, they totally took the blueprint of the building when they got it. They purchased it from the school district. Again, because they're a magnet, they elicited the help of school architects and designers, and had loads of community forums with students and parents on what a school should look like. So the third spaces, the ledges, the ballroom, the library, which they called the living room of the school. All of those came from community feedback. So I think there's lots of opportunity to re-envision and re-see what schools look like if we have the flexibility and adaptability to do so. And the courage also, I have to say.
I think that leaves us on a hopeful note for sure. As you can see, there's a lot of interest in your topic. There's a lot more questions we didn't get to, but again, I encourage everyone to reach out to Dr. Porterfield if you would like to just continue the conversation.
Yes, please do.
So we thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining for this conversation. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your engagement with me. I'm really excited to continue the conversation. Hopefully some of you will reach out and we can continue chatting.
Excellent. And for everybody else, our series continues on Wednesday at noon. We're going to have Dr. Emery Petschauer from Michigan State University, who will be doing a presentation called Listen Up, Sound-Making Publics in Urban Education. You will have to register for that too. Dr. Simmons put the registration link in the chat if you're interested. So thank you everybody for your time and for attending our inaugural start to our Urban Education Brown Bag series.
Thank you very much.